At 7:17 on the morning of the 30th of June 1908, in the deep, remote heart of the Siberian taiga, the sky split open. A pillar of fire, a column of blue light, brighter and hotter than the sun, descended from the heavens. A local Evenki reindeer herder, Semyon Semyonov, was sitting on the porch of his trading post at Vanavara, 40 miles south of the event. The heat, he later reported, was so intense he felt his shirt was on fire. A wave of invisible force picked him up and threw him 20 feet, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, the world he knew was gone. The forest around him was flattened, burning. He was not alone. Hundreds of miles away, farmers saw the same terrible light. In towns 400 miles distant, windows shattered and doors were blown off their hinges. The conductor of the Trans-Siberian Railway, nearly 500 miles to the south, saw the flash and, feeling the ground tremble, stopped his train, believing it had derailed. The explosion registered on seismic instruments across the globe, from Washington, D.C. to Jakarta. It sent a pressure wave through the atmosphere that circled the entire planet twice. For days afterward, a strange, beautiful, and terrifying phenomenon occurred. The skies over Europe and Asia glowed. In London at midnight, one could read a newspaper by the strange silvery nightlight. The comet's dust, or whatever it was, had seeded the upper atmosphere. A single cataclysmic event had occurred, releasing energy estimated at 1,000 times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It had flattened 80 million trees, scorching a region of over 830 square miles, an area the size of modern Tokyo. And yet, it had happened in a place so remote, so alien to the modern world, that no one saw it. No scientists, no reporter. The survivors were scattered, nomadic tribes whose stories were dismissed as legend. The silence that followed was as profound as the blast. This was not a mystery. It was an event that had happened outside of history. And when, decades later, humanity finally arrived to investigate it, they were confronted with a single, core, agonizing question that defines the event. What creates the power of a city-killing asteroid, the fire of a star, but leaves behind no body, no weapon, and no crater? What exactly detonated over the Podkamanaya Tunguska River? To find the answer to that blast, we must first go through the fire of human history. The world, in 1908, was busy. Tsarist Russia was a crumbling empire, deaf to the tales of shamans in its farthest, most godforsaken territory. Then came the Great War, then the Bolshevik Revolution. The world was remade in blood and ideology. The burning forest in Siberia was forgotten, a footnote in a diary of a dead road. The secret was kept under snow and swamp for 19 years. It would not be a government or an army that uncovered it, but one man, a man possessed. His name was Leonid Kulik. He was a scientist, a mineralogist, and a true believer. He was not just a researcher, he was a patriot. Convinced that the Tunguska Event was a massive iron meteorite. This was not just a scientific curiosity. To Kulik, it was a practical one. In the new, struggling Soviet Union, a mountain of celestial iron would be a gift to the revolution, a treasure to build the new state. He lobbied the Soviet Academy of Sciences relentlessly, and in 1927, backed by the state, he launched the first true Tunguska expedition. What he endured was a journey into a different century. He and his team traveled by the Trans-Siberian Railway, then by horse, then by reindeer sled, and finally, on foot, poling their way up the Tunguska River in remote, tormented by swamps and clouds of mosquitoes, so thick they blacked out the Sunday. But what he found, in that spring of 1927, was not a treasure. It was a biblical scene of destruction. He wrote in his journal of a continuous fall of forest, a wind-fallen wood that went on and on for dozens of miles. He was the first human to map the apocalypse. The blast pattern was a giant, terrifying butterfly, two great wings of destruction spreading out from a central point. The 830 square miles of flattened trees were all pointing away from this ground zero. As Kulik and his men marched toward the center, the scene became more Andam, A-E. He was walking into the mouth of the mystery, and then he reached the epicenter. He expected to find a crater, a hole the size of a city, filled with shattered rock and iron. Instead, he He found the single most haunting and inexplicable feature of the entire event. He found the telegraph poles. At the very center of the blast, the trees were not knocked over. They were standing, dead, upright. They were stripped of every branch, every leaf, as if some divine force had plucked them clean. They were scorched, skeletal, standing in silent testimony. Kulik was a man of science. He understood in that moment what he was seeing. This was not an impact. The trees were standing because the blast had not come from the side. It had come from above. This was an air burst. The object, whatever it was, had exploded in the sky. Kulik's dream of a great iron meteor, of a gift to the state, died in that grove of telegraph poles. But his obsession was reborn. He was no longer a prospector. He was a detective. For the next decade, Kulik launched 3 more expeditions. He became the faucet of the tiger, a man consumed by the green hell. He photographed the site, he interviewed the eventual witnesses, he tried, desperately, to find the smoking gun. He became convinced the object had shattered, and the fragments were buried in the soft, marshy ground. He identified a 100-foot wide ball, the Suflov crater, and spent an entire season pumping the water out, digging in the permafrost, only to find nothing, just old, preserved trees at the bottom. He found microscopic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock and metal in the soil. This was proof of something, but it was not his mountain of iron. Kulik's quest ended in tragedy. In 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Kulik, despite his age and scientific standing, volunteered for the Red Army. He was captured, and in 1942, this man who had survived the Tiger, who had stared into the epicenter of a cosmic blast, died in a German POW camp from typhus. He died, his great mystery unsolved. The forest, it seemed, had won. Kulik's death marked the end of the first chapter. The second chapter, the investigation, would be waged not by men in swamps, but by scientists with slide rules and later supercomputers. Kulik had left them the crime scene data, a massive airburst 5 to 6 miles high and no crater. Now the competing theories began. The first and most obvious is the meteorite hypothesis. This is the evolution of Kulik's original idea. The Lern-Diem thesis is that a stony, not iron, asteroid or meteor entered the atmosphere. A dense iron object would have punched through and hit the ground, but a more fragile, stony object, perhaps 200 feet across, would not. It would have entered the atmosphere at a shallow angle, hit the dense lower air like a stone hitting water, and the aerodynamic pressure would have caused it to catastrophically shatter and vaporize in a terminal explosion. The supporting evidence is strong. This is what asteroids do. The blast power is consistent. The discovery of the microscopic spherules, rich in nickel and iridium elements rare on Earth, but common in meteorites, seems to be definitive proof. This is the Occam's razor solution. It was a space rock, but the counter evidence is subtle. A stony asteroid that large is still quite dense. Would it really have vaporized so completely? Why is the iridium layer so thin? Why, in 1988, did a scientific team that analyzed the peat layer from 1908 find no spike in iridium, the one unquestionable signature of a meteor? And this theory, while logical, struggled to explain the most beautiful part of the mystery, the glowing nights in London. This leads to the second and most scientifically elegant theory, the comet hypothesis. The Lern-Diem here is that the object was not a rock at all. It was a dirty snowball. A small comet, a fragment perhaps from Encke's comet, composed of ice, dust, and frozen gases like methane and ammonia. The supporting evidence for this is almost too perfect. It fits every single piece of the puzzle. The airburst, a fragile, icy body entering the atmosphere at 60,000 miles per hour, would never survive the plunge. It would hit the dense air and disintegrate in a fraction of a second, detonating with all its kinetic energy, 5 to 6 miles high. The lack of crater. This is perfectly explained. The object was ice. It vaporized. There was nothing to hit the ground. The lack of fragments. Again, it was ice and dust. It would have scattered, leaving no crater, no mountain of iron. The glowing skies. This is the smoking gun for the comet theory. What are comets famous for? Their tails. The explosion would have dumped millions of tons of fine ice crystals and microscopic dust into the upper atmosphere. This high-altitude noctilucent cloud would have caught the sunlight, reflecting it down and explaining exactly why. For days afterward, you could read a newspaper at midnight in London. This theory became the scientific consensus. It was neat, it was total, it explained everything. The case was closed, or was it? The counter-evidence here is that science hates a perfect story. Some geochemists have argued that the chemical signature in the soil is not consistent with a comet, which should have been rich in specific elements. They argue that the blast, a pure thermal explosion, should have left a massive deposit of water, ice, on the ground, which was not found. The comet is the best fit, but it is not a perfect fit. This slight crack in the door, this lack of 100% certainty, has allowed a third category of theories to flourish: the exotic and the fringe. These theories are born from the sheer, almost supernatural scale of the event. The first are scientific but exotic. In the 1,970 seconds, two physicists proposed that the event was caused by a miniature black hole passing through the Earth. The entry wound was the Tunguska blast. This was briefly, thrillingly popular. The counter-evidence? There was no exit wound and no evidence whatsoever. Another exotic proposal was a matter-antimatter annihilation. A small piece of antimatter from space hitting our matter atmosphere would annihilate, converting 100% of its mass into pure energy. This would explain the blast and the total lack of debris. The counter-evidence? There is no known source for antimatter rocks in the universe. It is a solution more complex than the problem. And then there is the fringe. In 1946, the Soviet science fiction writer Alexander Kazantsev wrote a story. He had just seen the newsreels of Hiroshima. He saw the mushroom cloud, the telegraph poles of stripped trees, the airburst, and he proposed a chilling new theory. The Tunguska event was a nuclear explosion, but in 1908, it must, he concluded, have been an alien spacecraft, its nuclear reactor malfunctioning and detonating. This Tunguska UFO theory took root. It was the Roswell of Russia. It explained the maneuvering of the light, the lack of debris. The counter-evidence, of course, is total. There is zero evidence of a UFO. More importantly, the peat bogs at the epicenter, when analyzed, showed no long-term, anomalous radiation. It was not a nuclear event, it was a kinetic one. And so we are left standing in the new forest that has grown up in the last 117 years. The telegraph poles are gone, rotted back into the earth. The taiga, in its slow, patient way, has reclaimed the world. The consensus, the near certainty, is the comet, or a very fragile asteroid, a celestial visitor. But the event has transcended its own explanation. The true mystery of Tunguska is not what it was, but what it represents. It is a warning. This was the first terrifying impact event of the modern technological age. It was a city killer, 1,000 Hiroshimas, and it exploded over one of the most remote, unpopulated places on Earth. What if it had been 4 hours and 47 minutes later? The Earth, in its rotation, would have turned. The pillar of fire would not have descended over the empty taiga. It would have descended over street, Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire. History, as we know it, would have ended. The Tunguska event is a gravestone for a city that was never destroyed. The universe, it seems, is a shooting gallery, and we are living in the quiet seconds between the shots. What remains is not the what, but the when. What really whispers from the heart of that regrown forest is the final haunting question. When will the next one come?